If I asked you which country has the most startups valued over $1 billion per capita, aka unicorns, which country would you guess? The US, Israel, or maybe Singapore? Well, all of these are doing pretty well, but you'd still be wrong, because in the first place, way ahead of everyone else is a country that you may not have even heard of. A country that was still part of the Soviet Union just 30 years ago, with basically no economy to even speak of. But that today, despite being one of the smallest countries in Europe, it has more unicorns than much larger countries like Mexico, Poland, or Indonesia, or even highly developed countries like the Netherlands. And that is now widely considered to be the most digitalized country in the world, Estonia. But the fact that Estonia is so successful, or that this success goes by almost completely unnoticed, is not actually the most interesting thing about it. What's the really interesting part is how it got there. How do you build a country from scratch to a tech hub in just 30 years? Well, in case of Estonia, this was not an accident, but rather a result of a visionary strategy, and the fact that the country itself was in a way built as a startup as well, by taking bold, radical decisions, obsessing over one single goal, and doing things completely differently than everyone else. So how did Estonia manage to become Europe's startup nation? And what is it doing so differently from any other country in Europe? This is the rise of Estonia. But let's start at the beginning, because while things seem pretty good today, if we go back to what Estonia looked like a couple decades ago, things could not be any more different. Although Estonia experienced a relatively brief period of independence in between the world wars, soon after the Second World War started, it was annexed by the Soviet Union and became a clog in the machine of the Soviet communist economy as the Estonian Soviet Republic. And like in the rest of the Eastern Bloc, the 40 years of communism that followed were mostly marked by stagnation of the economy, isolation from the rest of the world, and overall feeling of hopelessness. The economy of the Soviet Union was radically different from economies of capitalist nations, as it was based on central control, planning, and ownership, which basically meant that private businesses were basically non-existent. The state owned and operated everything from factories to shops, and the economy was not run by supply and demand, but instead by 5-year plans that dictated what and in what quantity will be produced in the next 5 years. Which, being a highly inefficient system, resulted in a constant stream of shortages of the most basic goods. Once Estonia became a part of this centrally controlled machine, the Soviet leadership decided that its economic purpose would be based almost entirely on extracting Estonian natural resources and distributing them to the rest of the USSR. And so for Estonia, for the next 4 decades, it found itself with little to no advanced industries or sectors. As a result, by the time that the Soviet Empire started to fall apart and Estonia regained its independence, its economy was basically a wreck. The state-planned economy was deeply dysfunctional and mismanaged. The free market didn't exist, and Estonian economy was based purely on providing and processing resources like oil and gas for the Soviet Union. In other words, nothing about Estonia would suggest that 30 years later it should turn into a tiny tech and startup superpower. So, what happened? Well, there are 3 reasons that are behind Estonia's rise to success. First, culturally and historically, Estonia has always been quite close to the Nordics, and especially to Finland. And so, when it regained independence, it had a very clear goal: to catch up with their Nordic cousins that it saw as role models. But very early on, Estonia realized that if it took the traditional route that most of the post-communist countries were taking, betting on heavy industries, trying to survive on the remnants of what was left from the communist era, and trying to offer cheap labor to foreign investors, they would never catch up with them. The Nordics are one of the most economically developed countries in the world, and the gap was just too wide to cross if they would just do the same thing as everyone else. And so, while Estonia was still struggling with the post-revolution chaos and the painful adaptation to free market economy, they made a very bold and visionary decision that from then on, they will focus all their efforts on one thing and one thing only, on becoming a country that is built on new and emerging technologies. And they would bet everything on this card and do everything to shape the country in such a way that will make this possible. from the economy to how the government itself works. Now, that's a pretty ambitious goal, but how do you start if you don't have any of that? Well, Estonians recognize that the future performance of the country is dependent on the future performance of their people. In other words, the only way to get ahead is by investing into your human capital. And the best way to do that is by education. But even though every country and every politician says how important education is, but they never do anything about it, Estonia actually did it. In 1996, Estonia launched something called Tiger Leap, a program that aimed to completely revolutionize their education system. Step number 1, introduce technology. Even though in 1991 half of the country didn't have a telephone, Estonia decided that they will give every student in the country access to this new, exciting and emerging technology called the internet. And they actually did it. By the year 2000, when half of the US households still didn't have access to internet, every single school in Estonia had computers, and every single student had access to the internet, was encouraged to use it, and most of the teachers were trained in how to use it in class. Step 2, double down. Just having computers doesn't do that much, and what matters is knowing how to work with them. And so the country continued to expand implementing them in the education. Like in 2012, when Estonia became the first country in the world to start teaching programming and computer science to 6-year-olds in elementary schools. Step 3, improve your science and STEM education. Pretty early on, Estonia realized that apart from knowing how to use computers, science and math education is extremely important as well. But they also recognized that the way science is being taught does not actually yield the best results. And so in 2010s, they invited a British pioneer of math education to help Estonia implement a new revolutionary way of teaching mathematics across the country. This new way focused on students developing problem-solving skills rather than just doing equations. And instead of teaching them how to do the same thing that computers can already do but much better, it would focus on teaching them how to combine mathematical thinking and computer science. And rather than focusing on providing exclusive high-quality education to small groups of very bright kids, Estonia decided to take the opposite approach and focus instead on providing education to as many kids as possible by making everything, including textbooks or school lunches, completely free. And well, while this sounds nice, what really counts at the end of the day are results. And in that way, Estonia definitely delivered. In international tests that compare math, reading, and science skills, Estonian students in 2022 outperformed the entire rest of Europe, US, UK, and Canada, and they ranked among the top 8 in the world, going head-to-head with Asian countries like Singapore and South Korea, and they did it while spending much less per student than US, UK, or Canada. In other words, what Estonia managed to do over the past 3 decades has been to train several generations of kids who are now adults that are significantly more computer, math, and science savvy than their counterparts almost anywhere else. And by doing so, they created an enormous supply of future founders and employees for tech startups and companies. But it didn't stop there. Once you have the people, you also need a business environment that will be friendly and welcoming to entrepreneurship and innovation. And that's exactly what the Estonian government has been building for the past 20 years. Since the year 2000, Estonians have been able to declare taxes fully online. It takes about 3 minutes on average. They have had digital IDs since 2001, electronic signatures of legal documents since 2002, voting online since 2005, and they're able to marry by submitting an online application since 2022. By the end of this year, Estonia plans to have 100% digital government, meaning that every single thing you need from the government or the government needs from you can be done online. And 100% of all the data is accessible online as well. And all of this has very clear economic advantages. Starting a business in Estonia takes just 15 minutes, and it's fully online. And Estonia offers e-residency to foreign entrepreneurs, meaning that you can establish a company and pay the Estonian flat 20% corporate tax without ever stepping foot in the country. In other words, what Estonia did was to remove all the friction that might make starting and running a business more difficult, and it's done everything to make it as easy as possible. But there is one problem. How do you build global companies in a market that's made up of just over 1 million people? Less than half the population of Brooklyn in New York City. Well, you don't. But Estonia actually managed to turn this major disadvantage into a major superpower. Now, many European countries have populations from somewhere between 5 to 60 million people. Markets that are big enough for you to build a solid-sized business, but way too small for you to grow it into a global company. And so many European entrepreneurs focus on dominating and scaling in their own country, and they end up building medium-sized businesses that then stay limited to that particular market. A dynamic that is one of the reasons why Europe in general has so few large tech companies. But Estonia doesn't have the same problem. Because the market is so small, every Estonian entrepreneur knows that focusing on the domestic market just doesn't make any sense. And so from the beginning, almost every digital company naturally goes for the global market instead. As Estonians themselves say, Estonia isn't your market, it's your accelerator. It's where you find your product market fit, get ready to scale, and try what works. But then you have to go out there and go big, because there's no room to grow at home. And so all that makes Estonia the ultimate breeding ground for startups. A government that is not afraid of making bold decisions and swinging for the fences, a tech-savvy and STEM-focused population, and a natural need to expand because of the market limitations. And so it's not a coincidence that tech companies like Skype, Bolt, and Wise have all originated there, or why Europe's youngest billionaire is an Estonian founder of a tech company, and why it's almost guaranteed that many more will follow.